Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vikas Pota, and I have the honor of bringing to you a subject that we're all very curious and interested in, which is about the use of technology in education, or EdTech as it's called. You know, the central thing today is whilst society has moved on with great strides, you look at all the different innovation that's happened. Look at the really embraced the iPhone and all these devices. You look at how ways of working in the corporate workplace have changed. Even when you think about those that you characterize as blue-collar jobs and what technology has brought to them, they too have been revolutionized to a degree. And so the question I ask really is, why haven't we seen the same kind of pace in our schools, in K-12 education, as it's often referred to? And so for that, I want to bring a friend of mine, someone who I've known for a very long time, and is the co-director for the Center for Universal Education at Brookings Institution, Emiliana Vegas. Emiliana, welcome to this live stream. Emiliana, you're on mute.
Thank you, Vikas. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about Brookings before we start talking about the actual subject matter.
Great. So Brookings is one of the oldest think tanks based in Washington, D.C. It was established over 100 years ago to provide evidence to policymakers to make better decisions. And we have historically a focus on U.S. policymakers, but about 40 years ago, we developed a program called Global Economy and Development that really takes a global look at and provides evidence for global decision makers in multiple areas, including education. That's where we come in at the center.
Thanks a lot for that. And you and your co-director, Rebecca Winthrop, are established features to promote. You've done much good to promote an equitable education for many through your analysis, your reports, and all of your work. I want to start off by asking you, do you believe in the promise of technology yourself?
You know, I really do. I think technology has changed so many aspects of our daily lives and so many important industries, such as the healthcare sector, transportation, I mean, just everything. And so I do think that it has a great promise for education. And the work we did was really to try to see how could we think about it differently? And you know, we know that it just has not disrupted education in the ways that it was expected originally.
So you come to the meat of the conversation, which is around, you've just written a report which you've published. And if you go to my Twitter handle or my LinkedIn page or even on the Facebook page, you will see a link to your report. And I'd welcome everyone to go and have a look at that. And that is today what we want to focus on. I mean, so I start off by asking you a question, why do you think it's not worked? And more importantly, when we think about schooling, and it's not a matter of individual teachers or individual schools, but how can systems actually embrace technology to a much greater extent and with success? What is your thinking around that?
So let me start with the first question. Why hasn't it worked? When we look at so the way that decision makers have introduced technology, it's really been more focused on deploying, let's say, devices and not thinking so much as to how would they actually change teaching and learning. Or what we call the instructional core, how students interact with content, teachers interact with content, and students interact with teachers. So that triangle is really important to really move the needle on learning. And when you just basically, let's say, for a simple technology, replace a blackboard with a smartboard, but the teaching is the same, you're still writing on the board and expecting students to learn somehow, then it's not surprising that a lot of the investments on smartboards didn't necessarily lead to increased learning. Same happens with laptops. If the instruction doesn't change and laptops are just substituting notebooks, then we were sort of naive to expect that just distributing laptops, even if they had some preloaded content, would have led to kids learning on their own, no more need for teachers, which is some of what the initial proponents of the sort of programs like the One Laptop Per Child were arguing for. So when we move forward, go ahead, Vika.
No, but many of these interventions you talk about are very much to do with hardware. But procurement and when it comes to procurement systems in particular, why is it that governments haven't looked at that facet of it? Because procurement systems aren't used to actually buying software services, as an example. Is that also something that you've looked at?
That's something that I certainly have a lot of experience in from my previous career at development banks, where it was very difficult to even, have procurement systems be able to provide resources for maintenance of devices. So very costly investments in devices with very little, let's say, contracts to help support the maintenance of these devices, the updating of the working software, etc. So it's a big constraint, but I think that is a regulatory issue, and it will address part of the problem if you can resolve it. But still, what we really want to move the needle on is on having decision makers really understand, what is it that you're trying to achieve in terms of improving learning? Are you trying to move a lot of kids into basic proficiency levels? Are you trying to reduce gaps between those that are not meeting basic proficiency and those that are exceeding, kind of advanced levels, and you have huge inequality? And then once you decide what is the problem you're trying to address, what is the evidence of what works to achieve that? And then where you are, like what is the current state in your own system? Do you have access to connectivity and devices or not? That's a basic one. But what capacity do teachers have to engage with technology? What capacity and familiarity do students and school leaders have as well? Maybe even parents, in the context of COVID, we need to take into account as well. So all of these factors is, in our playbook, really talk about, first and foremost, understanding the instructional core. So this idea that you have to focus on interactions between content, teachers, and students, and among the three. The second is you have to really understand where you are, diagnose your system. What are your infrastructure constraints, your capacity constraints, what's working in your own system and what's not. Third, establish real goals. What do you want to move? And then look at the evidence. And we try to synthesize the most recent evidence. And we argue that, one of the contributions of our summary of the evidence is that we don't do it by type of technology. We don't summarize, by hardware or software, but instead we focus on the goals and the comparative advantages of technology to improve learning. And we identify 4 of them, which I can quickly say, and we can go more in depth. But basically, they're scaling up standardized instruction, providing opportunities to differentiate instruction, provide expanding opportunities for students to practice, and finally, making learning more engaging through videos and games and the like that technology really is very good at.
So all the that's a really fascinating insight that you have there. Can I ask you, in terms of, because of COVID, we're seeing, I don't know about you, but we certainly as parents were deluged with the number of WhatsApps we had with regards to free downloadable resources and toolkits and software and all these kind of things. Do you think that's damaging to this discourse as to what works in EdTech?
I think the problem has been that there has been a lot of enthusiasm from the entrepreneurs and sort of the producers of the EdTech world to offer solutions. And these solutions are provided, and then it's been very hard for decision makers to sort through and then realize not only does this solution address my problems, but how does it interact with my current capacities and other maybe programs and software systems that I have, other solutions that I've already invested in. And so, I think it's okay. I mean, it's great that you have so much innovation and entrepreneurship and developing tools that people think might help. But what's really necessary is for us to take a step back and really think about what is it that we're trying to do in this particular context, and which of these solutions will help me get there. And that's really where I think there's been a disconnect.
So that leads me to the second part of this report, where we ask and I asked the question in terms of, how can school systems identify promising EdTech interventions? And before you answer this, I want to tell you about a short story about the report that you've written. And friends of mine in India from Avanti actually say that you cited them in your report. So thank you for that. And what they do is and actually I'm speaking to them tomorrow as a result of today's conversation on the live stream to understand from them how you bring learning to all using their very innovative method that they have in India. Now, tell me in terms of how does a school actually find out what works?
Well, it's very hard for each school to do that individually. And I think that's part of why at Brookings we're so interested in kind of doing this work and providing this as a public good. And there are others. I mean, I think as a community of, researchers, decision makers, we have to communicate better so that the research is aligned to what decision makers are really facing with. And they don't have to go out every time they have to make a decision. They really don't have the time. We know that they're in office for a relatively limited, period of time. They have constraints from all sources, financial constraints, political constraints, community constraints, and they have to, show results. And so the more that we can do the back work for them and sort of digest the evidence and present it in a way that they can act upon, that's what I think we can add value. And that's really the goal of reports like this one that we produce from the Center for Universal Education at Brookings.
But so how do you answer this question though? It's a real practical question I ask you. I'm a school system leader. Let's assume that. How do I identify today what works?
I would say go to our webpage, read our report. It will help you. And beyond that, I would say really understand what's right now in your system may be working. Build on that. Don't try to bring something that maybe is working well in India to South Africa today without first piloting it and adapting it and adjusting it to your context. I'm very inspired by the work that Young Love is doing in Botswana, adapting during COVID times to sending SMS messages to parents to gauge learning and help them engage with the learning. So both assess students where they are, meet them, and then provide them with learning opportunities in particularly in math, but also in literacy. And they have seen some significant progress, but they didn't do it perfectly from the beginning. And so when we were just hearing from Noam Angris, the founder and one of the researchers in the team, and he was saying, it's so important to pilot and you can learn quite quickly from a small pilot in a short period of time. You can really adapt an intervention to make it more likely to succeed in your particular context.
So Professor John Kim, who you'll be aware of at HBS in Massachusetts, actually gave me a really interesting way of thinking about EdTech. And he says, let's not complicate it. There's three things that EdTech can do for a school. One is to think in terms of efficiency and productivity, so school management systems and the like. And actually, a month or so ago, we had someone called Adam Still on this live stream, where he's created a company and a startup that looks at resource planning for teachers. Because the concern is that teachers spend a disproportionate time lesson planning when they don't need to be. And so the company is called Pango, and you should look at that. The second thing that Professor Kim talks about is to do with spanning distance and online learning, right? So we have plenty of example because of COVID in that regard. But the third bit is where you get a little bit more complicated, but where the true promise of technology is, which is in personalized learning. Mm-hmm. And so what did you see in regards to personalized learning and how it can be utilized in schools?
So that's a very good question and one that we looked at it in quite a lot of detail. what we found and let me just precede by saying that our research focused on rigorous research evaluations that have already taken place of EdTech intervention in low and middle income countries. Because our focus is really to how to address the needs of the most disadvantaged populations in the world. However, I would say these findings are applicable, of course, to any country that has inequality, which many countries, of course, do, a majority of them. So so just on that question, we also agree that one of the comparative advantages of technology is to differentiate instruction and provide personalized instruction. What we saw in the evidence is that it works especially well, for example, computer adaptive learning programs such as MindSparks in India, which was developed over almost a decade to tailor instruction in math and language and bring kids to a certain proficiency level. What we found is that it is especially useful when a lot of the students are falling behind. Personalized and adaptive computer learning can really help bring kids who are falling behind to a level where they master the basic skills and they can continue learning. So we see it as a great tool, particularly to bring the low kind of end of the performance distribution up. It is also, of course, going to be helpful to continue learning over time, but it makes less of a difference, let's put it that way.
And so, Emiliana, once we've answered this question, and as a school system leader, I've identified EdTech interventions. The next question that I come to is, how can school systems adopt these interventions to match their needs?
So, we give them like a 5-step thing. One is we say one of the most important things is to diagnose your own system. So there is an effective intervention out there. It will address your constraint, your goal. You have a clear objective, but then you have some capacities already in place and some real constraints. You may be in a system where there's no connectivity in remote areas or where there's low levels of electricity. I mean, when I was working in development banks and I traveled, I would often see computers available at a school in a remote area, but where students were unable to use it because not only lack of online connectivity, but even the basic things like lack of sufficient outlets to power up the computers to be able to use them, frequently while in school and even outside of school. So really understanding, and then the second thing is not just understanding the infrastructure, but the capacity of teachers, school leaders, students, and even parents, as I was saying. So are they familiar? Can you leverage some of that? Often students are more familiar and they're kind of digital natives, and the main constraint is coming from the teacher side. So how can you, quickly get teachers at least to not be afraid to be a learner from students, at least in the digital aspect of incorporating technology. And then we say it's so important to involve the stakeholders and in particular educators in the design of the intervention. Because if you really want to shift teaching and learning, you need them on board. There's so many experiences that we have seen and documented about programs that were, well designed from some central office, but once it was, rolled out, there was no take-up. Teachers didn't feel comfortable, they weren't familiar, they didn't feel like they were part of the decision. And teachers, they are the core to learning. There's so much evidence on that. So no matter how much technology we can pour, the teachers are going to continue playing a very important role. And I think one of the most important roles that they play is really keeping students engaged and interested in learning and keeping them, feeling like we care about them. And right now in COVID times with the distance learning, that's such a more difficult task, is to have each child know that there's an adult that cares about their trajectory and that is following through, even if that adult is not necessarily teaching them, but is helping them gain access to learning. That's what we see as kind of the shift that technology kind of really can present a great opportunity.
Do you, I obviously agree with you on the point regarding teachers. One of the things that I've found, Emiliana, is regarding, and I say this because we have an audience of teachers who are watching this as well, and I just want to make sure that we're crystal clear in what we're saying, is that one of the things that I've learned over time is that there's a very lazy argument that says teachers are a blocker when it comes to the adoption of technology. What did your report find in that regard? How are teachers the blocker? And if they are, what can we do to remove that block?
No, teachers are not the blocker. Teachers sometimes have not been well supported to embrace technology in many cases, have not been, provided the training or the opportunity to participate in the design of the interventions, to give their own knowledge and experience about what may work well and what may absolutely not work in her or his particular classroom in school. And so I think that, that's why we insist so much on working with teachers to incorporate their insights. And one of the biggest problems of, kind of what we were talking about earlier, all these solutions that have been developed, often they don't have a teacher in the team, and even if they have one teacher does not necessarily represent all teachers. So you really need to include, a great majority of your teachers in your system to have an EdTech intervention that goes at scale and really moves the needle on learning.
So as you know, on the 30th of May, we had an event that talked about what the new normal for teachers would be. And one of the elements that came through, and one of the T's from the T4 was to do with technology. So the thing that we learned and we surmised at the end of it was that technology is here to stay, and teachers need to understand how they incorporate it in their learning. But for that, there's a big step to be taken, which is governments have to invest money in training and development of teachers. Do you see that happening?
So the reality is that most governments spend quite a bit of their education budget, besides on salaries, on training. But as my former colleague from the World Bank, who's now at the Center for Global Development, and their colleagues have done when they did a very systematic review of the evidence of teacher training programs, is that they haven't been effective. And why? I think it's because a lot of these programs bring a great number of teachers for a one-day, lecture-based, here's the new thing, now go out and implement it. And what appears to be much more promising is sort of one-to-one coaching and mentoring for teachers in a long-term and sustained basis. And the majority of the teacher training investments, particularly in developing countries, are not of that nature. And so whether it's for adoption of technology or for adoption of a new curriculum reform or a new method of teaching a particular subject, for all these reasons, the majority of the teacher training programs in developing countries have been a huge failure, but they have happened, unfortunately. So there is money going to that. It just needs to be invested much better.
So we've got some questions coming in. I want to bring this up first from Mark Powell, who's commented on LinkedIn. He says, that's a really great conversation. I'll let you read the comment. Do you have a response to something like this?
Let's see.
The inequities that we see in the use of technology. What do you have to say about that?
Well, that's one of the biggest, let's say, tragedies or that has always been there. So the digital divide, so-called, between not just low-income countries and high-income countries, but between low-income and high-income communities in, medium and high-income countries. And maybe one of the things that, I know at Brookings we're thinking a lot is, what is access to connectivity a new human right? Because in this world where information, is everything, both to get the skills you need as well as to now have, the social interactions that we as humans need, connectivity is key. And
I don't want to put you in a tight spot, so please tell me if I need to move on. But is there a position that you have at Brookings on the right to free internet?
I wouldn't know if Brookings wide we have that position, although I do know that one of our presidential initiatives or one of the priorities of our current leadership at Brookings has to do with ensuring that technology is used for good. And we're investing a lot in that. And I think part of that has to do with expanding access to all.
Fast thinking there, Emiliana. So there's a fairly controversial comment now that's coming up, and I hope George is watching. And I'd like your response to this. I have a response, but I want you to respond.
Okay. George, I've been thinking about it. Oh, that is a very controversial.
What do you have to say?
Yeah, what I would say is I don't think it's an either or. So I think that, everyone should have the opportunity to learn basic literacy and numeracy, some foundational knowledge in science and civics, and have the opportunity to develop kind of the so-called 21st century skills, critical thinking, creativity, and problem-solving skills, and communication, of course. I think that should be, and I'm not sure that's academic. I think that is kind of the basics that we all, for to be a functioning person in the 21st century, we have to have. I think a very good way to acquire many of these skills is through technical vocational training. And I do think that there's evidence, there's growing evidence of that. Some of my former colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank just published a very interesting paper on this. And I would say, that in there's always a good reason or a good argument for including some employability skills in the education trajectory of individuals. But do we want to necessarily only give them a job that will basically mean that they have to stay in a particular community and will only be able to work in a particular industry? I think we've learned that that's a big mistake given how rapidly, in part due to technology, all the industries are changing. So the key is to give everybody the skills they need to continue learning and adapting.
So I'd say to the questioner that there's at last year's World Economic Forum Africa Summit in Cape Town, there was the then Minister of Innovation for the country of Sierra Leone, who is now the Education Minister, David Senge, was asked this question on a panel. And I want you to actually go to the internet and do a Google about David Senge, WEF Cape Town panel, and you look at the response he gave when he said, what is the point of pursuing fourth industrial revolution strategies when you miss the second and third in Sierra Leone in Africa? And so it's quite an interesting perspective that he provides that I think we would be well versed to actually listen to. I now go to who, again, the name isn't coming up, but I think obviously this is Carla Ertz, a former colleague of mine and a dear friend. She says, one day professional learning is not sustainable. The method does not provide return on investment. Peer-to-peer coaching is ideal. Is that what you found, Emiliana?
So in this particular EdTech report, this is not something that we analyze, but there's a lot of evidence that what you're saying is true. And previous work I've done on sort of professional development with other colleagues certainly points in that direction. So a lot of, particularly I must say, for novice teachers, mentoring is critical to get them, to get them to be effective teachers. In those first few years of teaching, any of us who have taught know that we are not that effective, that it's really hard work. And having, if you can have someone there to kind of walk you through, tell you what you're doing well, where opportunities for improvement, that makes a huge difference.
Emiliana, I want to hold your feet to fire. I know that you will say that I've been doing that throughout, but this last question I want to ask you, and what I would really love it for you to actually name names, okay? And so these are good names that I'm asking you to name. Which education system is doing it right? And so are there those that come to your mind that actually you could say are exemplars?
I have a special place in my heart for Uruguay because it has made such progress on incorporating technology nationwide It started as a one-to-one program, one laptop per child, with not an educational purpose primarily. The primary purpose was to connect the entire country, and schools were used as the means to achieve that. But the school system side of it, and it wasn't run by the school administration. The public school administration had a lot of, I think, thoughtful leaders and teachers at the time, and they saw it. They didn't want to miss the opportunity, and I think because of that, they. I would say, well, it's a program that now has the Plan Stable has been now in existence for over 13, 14 years. It has evolved over time. There are many initiatives in it. So it went from being, the original goal was to have teachers be able to use the laptops with their students in classrooms and, deploy the programs, to now having a lot of different initiatives, such as, English instruction with native English speakers across the world who can provide live lessons to students in classrooms, which is much better than trying to get native Spanish speakers to be not only fluent and proficient in English, but also good English teachers. You have incredible robotic programs. I was just in a conference hearing about, and then you have, the opportunity in an unexpected pandemic to have everybody continue learning remotely. And even when they reopened schools, because they were controlled the pandemic pretty early on, they continued with hybrid education and lots of distance learning for students who, some days a week cannot go to in-person instruction. So I think that's one model that is not very well known outside Latin America, actually, and even in Latin America, not fully understood. How multidimensional. I mean, they've partnered with Michael Fullan's initiative for deep learning to ensure that, technology is not just a device, but really a way of changing instruction nationwide.
So this is a question that comes up from Lakvir Laka, which I'm not sure plays to your report, but it's interesting to take because there's a lot of concern around this.
Yes, that's a question we get often. There is a lot that is difficult for the younger students. You can't expect them to sit, in front of a laptop for 8 hours, like we adults who are, fortunate enough to continue working during the pandemic are basically forced to do. Not that it's super enjoyable either for us, but we have the capacity to focus and we're not as in need of physical activity as young children and as socio-emotional support. I think technology, again, as for older students, it shouldn't be seen as the solution. It should be seen as a tool to solve some problems. So right now we have a big problem that kids, even the young kids, can't go back to school in many parts of the world. How can we use technology smartly to offer them some learning opportunities? For the youngest one, it might be through games. It might be the smartest way. It might be through just a phone call with the teacher and not the laptop or the Zoom, just a regular telephone call or maybe a FaceTime call if you have a smartphone. So I think it's just, again, my main message is it's a tool. We're very fortunate to be living in a period of time when these tools have evolved so much that they can be fast, they can be creative, and they can be relatively inexpensive compared to what they used to cost. But they're not going to solve all our problems.
So at the very beginning of the pandemic, I asked a question as to who's won the COVID battle when it comes to tech. And the responses I was getting were Microsoft because of the use of Teams, Zoom because of the platform. There's something called House Party that quickly sank as well at the same time. All of these different kind of communication media it seemed to have done very well. Would you categorize them as EdTech?
Well, we tend to refer to EdTech as those technologies that are specifically designed for educational purposes. So Zoom is increasingly being used by schools and school systems, but it's also being used for example, by Brookings to work on a regular basis. Same with, Teams, to give another example of another similar platform, or Blue Jeans. So we would consider them as complementary, but the traditional EdTech, for example, is one program that I'm familiar with that basically provides audible stories to children to help them get familiar with reading. And a lot of kids don't have parents who can read to them at home. And they're not yet at the capacity where they can read. And what this program does is it really it's like it's a storytelling of, lots of stories and fun books, not textbooks. And we found is that some of them are actually very good at getting kids to read, because they can both read live and listen to and have better comprehension. So all I'm saying is, we classify EdTech as things that are meant to really help education. But, as you were saying earlier, there's a lot of technology that is used also that people refer to as EdTech, that is really about improving efficiency, for example, teacher management practices or payroll. And so they're specifically designed for school systems, but they're not really affecting teaching and learning.
Emiliana, I thank you and your co-authors in publishing this report and this playbook, as you call it. And I also doff my hat to Rebecca Winthrop and yourself for being one of the heroes that I have, during the pandemic, for trying to signpost people as to what works and what doesn't, and try to make sense for system leaders around the world. Thank you once again, and I look forward to hosting you on this live stream in the future. Thanks a lot for your time, and goodbye.
Thank you for having me, Vikas. I really enjoyed it.